Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, to today's webinar. We just give it 1 more minute before we start for people to log on. All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar in preparation or as the launch event of the second public consultation within the development of the Science-Based Targets Initiative's Net Zero Standard. Next slide, please, before we jump into it. I would like to run you through the agenda and a couple of housekeeping notes and of course present you to today's speakers. Next slide, please. So first of all, today's session will be recorded and we will send all registrants a copy of the presentation and the recording shortly after the webinar. We would like you to engage with us throughout the session by submitting your questions in the Q&A box, and we will have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end of this session. Today's speakers are Alberto Carrillo-Pineda, the Managing Director and Co-founder of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, as well as Emma Watson, Senior Manager at Net Zero, and myself, I'm the Global Manager of the Committed Action Team. I'm very happy to be with you today. So firstly, we will hear an introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative from Alberto, and then many of you will know that in July, the Science-Based Targets Initiative has launched has published a new strategy to raise ambition to 1.5 degrees. So we're going to hear a little bit more about why and how we're doing that, and then we'll dive into an overview of the standard development process on the first science-based net zero target setting framework, and then of course speak a little bit about the public consultation that opens today and inform you about how you can participate. Then, as already mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session. So as a reminder, please use the Q&A box that you should find at the bottom of your screen, and then we wrap up the webinar. So with no further ado, I would like to hand over to Alberto.
Great. Thanks, Leah, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We are very excited about getting closer to the launch of the standard, and yeah, very grateful to have you today and to have your input in the second consultation process. As Leah mentioned, the idea is to start with a brief overview about the Science-Based Targets Initiative. For those of you who are not very familiar with who we are and our work, the Science-Based Targets Initiative is a partnership between CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And we've been working closely with Win Business Coalition, Race to Zero, and many other partners that help amplify and drive the adoption of science-based targets. Our goal is really to drive the adoption and implementation of decarbonization targets in the corporate sector and the financial sector that are consistent with the pace needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. If you go to the next slide, please. We have today around 1,800 companies that are in the target setting process. We have almost 900 companies that have already their targets approved, and around 700 companies that have committed to align their ambition to 1.5 degrees, or they're already in the process of aligning their ambition. And these companies represent about 20% of the global economy and the number is growing rapidly every month. Um, Now, companies setting science-based targets are actually delivering on their science-based targets. We conducted an analysis for our progress report that was released at the beginning of this year. And what we found out is that in the period between 2015 and 2020, companies reduced their emissions in average by 25% in this period. And at the same time, global emissions increased by 3.4%. And the typical company in the SBTi is reducing their emissions at the rate of around 6.4% per year. And this exceeds the rate that is needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So we see that the model of setting public climate targets works, and we want to see many more companies joining this movement. Great. Now, a few months ago, we announced our new strategy for 2021-2025. And this strategy has as its core basically ensuring that we align to the latest science. Go to the next slide, please. When the SBTi was launched in 2015, before COP21 and the Paris Agreement was adopted, the world was focusing on 2 degrees, and that's also the latest science that was available. And based on that, when we launched the framework, we started with 2 degrees as the main framework for target setting. Then the IPCC released its special report on 1.5 degrees in October 2018. And since then, we started a process to transition SBTi into 1.5 degrees. And we developed resources to enable companies to align to 1.5 degrees. And we started this campaign called Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees, through which we've been galvanizing ambition from companies that are aligning to the most ambitious goal. And also in parallel, we started the process to define net zero for the corporate sector, acknowledging that net zero was an imminent part of the IPCC report, and also an important element to inform ambition at the corporate and country level. And so, of course, the process that we are discussing today is all part of this development. And during the consultation process that we conducted last time, we received quite positive feedback and also a lot of support for making sure that science-based targets are consistent with 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. And in line with this, and also considering that we have today already a majority of companies that are setting 1.5 degree aligned targets, and that we have many more companies that are aligned to these through the business ambition for 1.5 degrees. The SBTi decided to raise ambition to 1.5 degrees as the minimum ambition in the SBTi. Next slide, please. And so we announced this in July 2021. And so that means that we gave 1 year of grace period, and from 2022 onwards, the SBTi will only be validating targets that are 1.5 degree aligned. And this includes, of course, shorter term targets, near-term targets, as we call them in the standard, and then also long-term net zero targets. And we are, of course, very confident that companies are going to be able to step up to the challenge, and we are seeing, ambition being scaled up everywhere at the country level, at the city level, financial institutions and companies. And we have, of course, a clear sense of urgency from the scientific community. And we trust companies are going to be stepping up to the challenge. So this is it from me. I hand over back to Lea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for this great overview. So next we'll hear from Emma about the net zero standard development process.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you to everyone for joining us either this morning or this afternoon. As Leah said, we're super excited to get started with the pre-launch public consultation. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background on the Net Zero Standard process and then talk about where we are at the moment. So as you might be aware, there is a current lack of clarity for companies in what it means to be net zero. And this is really why the SBTi began to develop the global net zero standard for company target setting. So essentially this project really kicked off about a year ago when we published the Net Zero Foundations paper last September. So this paper really spelled out the foundations for the work that we've been doing over the last year. It's a really great resource and it's available on our website. So if you haven't had a chance to read that paper, I would highly recommend looking through and having a deeper look at that. So after we published the Net Zero Foundations paper, the next step was really to figure out the guiding principles. And of course, this was very much informed by the Foundations paper. In order to do this, we formed an expert advisory group. So at the moment, that group is about 40 people, and it's made up of representatives from business, academia, science, and civil society. So that's really the main consensus building body for the Net Zero Standard, and I'll talk about our governance structure in a little bit more. But really, we began to work with that expert advisory group and also our own internal teams at the SBTi develop criteria that would underpin the Net Zero Standard. And then after that, we began to develop guidance. So the Net Zero Standard really is made up of guidance and criteria, but there's also some other elements as well that I'll go through in a minute too. So really, the aim of the project is just to be able to help, develop a framework to help companies set really robust and credible net zero targets that are in line with a 1.5 CE future. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're going through quite an in-depth process to develop the Net Zero Standard. And we want to be really transparent and inclusive through this process as well. And the code that we're using to help us along in this process is the ICO standard setting code of good practice, as well as the greenhouse gas protocol standard setting process. As mentioned, we have convened an expert advisory group, and we really tried to get a balanced representation from all different areas within that group so that we weren't biased to one side or another when making decisions. And we have gone through 2 phases of public consultation. So obviously this begins the second phase of public consultation, but we did go through an earlier public consultation at the beginning of this year. And I'll walk you through some of the results from that process later on in the presentation. In addition to our expert advice groups, well, I can, if we go back, sorry, one slide. Thank you. So in addition to engaging with our expert advisory group, we are also engaging with our permanent advisory group, so the technical advisory group and the scientific advisory group. So those groups are also helping us to make robust decisions as well. And really our process for making these decisions is looking at the science, but then building consensus around different nuances within that to help companies implement that in their own corporate strategies as well. So if we go on to the next slide, please. This slide really just shows the net zero project governance structure that we have. So as I mentioned, we have 3 different advisory bodies that we're working with. But the Net Zero Expert Advisory Group is really our main consensus building body. So we engage with them very regularly and to help us develop the standard. We, of course, have an executive board, so they ratify our decisions. However, they're not necessarily a decision-making body. And we also have within the SBTi, the project execution team. So we have a net zero project team, a net zero working group, as well as the technical working group within the SBTi that helps us in the process. And this is all overseen by our managing director and our steering committee as well. So this is kind of gives you an overview of the structure that we've placed under the Net Zero project. If we go on to the next slide, please. So just to give you an overview, and I won't go into this slide in too much detail, but essentially the Net Zero project entails quite a few different elements. So of course, the first, perhaps the most important piece is the standard development, and that's what we're putting out to public consultation today. So here we're looking at the criteria, the corporate manual, and any guidance documents that we provide. But behind that, we also have the technical development of the Net Zero standards. So figuring out the methods to be able to help companies determine the residual emissions that are left when they have abated their emissions in net zero scenarios. We have a net zero target setting tool. And I will just say that the net zero target setting tool has not been released as part of this public consultation, as we're expecting some significant updates to mitigation pathways contained within that. So that will be released to the public in January next year. On top of that, we of course have been engaging with our stakeholders throughout the process. So the public consultation, of course, being an example of this, but we've also undertaken a road test with companies, which I'll also go into more detail on later. We've been working with different companies and stakeholders one-on-one, and also building a pipeline of companies that are interested in the standard through the Business Ambition for 1.5C campaign. Communications, of course, and blogs and case studies, but of course there is the target validation element as well. So we will begin to validate net zero targets through the Science Based Targets Initiative in January next year. So we've also been developing target validation resources, so a submission form for companies, and we've been doing a pilot validation also from the road test companies, and looking at validating some of the first adopters as well. So that just gives you an overview of the different elements of the net zero standard. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So where are we in the process? So as I mentioned, the project really kicked off after we published the foundations paper last September. So we then convened the expert advisory group and started to draft the initial criteria from October until January. We then went through public consultation through mid-January to mid-March. So that was a longer public consultation, but really just focused on the criteria document that we had put out at that point. We then began to work internally and with the EAG to refine those criteria based on, of course, the feedback that we gained from the public consultation as well. And then we began to draft net zero guidance that would help companies then be able to set targets using the criteria that had been developed. So we then put that to a road test with companies in mid-July till the end of August. So that ended quite recently. And now, of course, we're beginning to we're starting the pre-launch public consultation. So the public consultation will run until the 6th of October. And then after that, we will be finalising the net zero standard before we launch in advance of COP26. So the standard launch date is planned for Thursday, the 28th of October at the moment. So if we go into the next slide, please. So as mentioned, at the very beginning of the year, we went through a process of public consultation on the net zero criteria. So we had an unprecedented amount of response to that public consultation. We had almost 400 responses. So that was either through the survey, which we had developed, or we had individual submissions as well. So we had quite a breadth of different stakeholders responding to that consultation from different geographies that also had different positions within the SBTi. So really this feedback was essential for us to go through that process of refining the criteria. So I just wanted to say thank you also from the SBTi for everyone who did respond to that consultation. The feedback was absolutely invaluable and helped us along in the process to get us to where we are now. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So here I'm just going to walk you through some of the key decisions that the SBTi came to based on the first public consultation feedback, and summarize that in 6 points. So today I won't go into too much detail also on the criteria within the net zero standard, which you'll be able to see within the manual that's published on the website now. But to give you some idea of the kind of the key criteria. So first of all, when we were going through that public consultation, with the previous maximum target timeframe for science-based targets is 15 years. Well, actually, that's the current timeframe as well. Within the net zero standard, that maximum timeframe year is going to be reduced to 10 years for near-term science-based targets. And based on the feedback that we got from the public consultation, it was quite clear that the 10 years was the maximum that the target should be set for. And in addition to that, we've found that most companies do actually set 10-year targets anyway. So we then decided to reduce that target timeframe. However, we are considering to allow a 15-year timeframe for sectors where short-term emission reductions are limited by long asset lifespans. So this is one of the questions that we are posing during this public consultation for your feedback. When we're looking at the next point, so we were looking at the ambition of near-term science-based targets. So as Alberto took you through, we are actually going to be increasing the minimum of ambition of near-term science-based targets from well below 2C to 1.5C for scopes 1 and 2. So that will come into play for all companies as of July next year. But for companies that want to set net zero targets, they will have to have near-term science-based targets that align with 1.5C. For scope 3, that ambition is going to be aligned with well below 2C. So it's slightly less ambitious requirement for a scope 3 emission reductions. For the long-term science-based targets, one of the questions that we asked is whether companies should be allowed to set absolute or intensity targets. So we have been able to look at the methodologies, and absolute and intensity targets will both be allowed. And we have been able to develop approaches for companies to set long-term science-based targets, which were tested during the company road test. When looking at the boundary of long-term science-based targets, which is essentially the net zero targets, it was found that it was extremely important for the net zero target to address all emissions within a company's boundary. So because of this, the scope 3 target boundary has been increased from 67% in the near term to 95% in the long term. So that's one key area of difference between the current requirements. Then when looking at the neutralization criteria, so we found from the public consultation feedback that these criteria needed further refinement. So we've been working with our expert advisory group and other stakeholders to conduct research to explore this area in a lot more detail. But in the meantime, in order to simplify the framework, we did remove the requirement to have an explicit neutralization target. So that would have been something along the lines of a company having to say they will neutralize X number of tons. However, now it's just implicit in the amount of emissions that aren't reduced by the time that you reach the net zero target. And then again, on the compensation piece of the criteria, we found that also needed further refinement. the feedback was that the current model that we had proposed wouldn't incentivize companies to set compensation targets or increase the amount of mitigation action they were taking outside of their value chain. So we're again working to further refine that criteria. However, some high-level criteria on both compensation and neutralization have been included within this public consultation. Great, okay. And if we go on to the next slide. So this just looks at some of the kind of open feedback that we got from our stakeholders through the public consultation that we went through earlier in the year. And we've looked at this feedback just to help us understand support for our direction of travel, but also areas that we could improve. So some of the things that, for example, we've tried to look at is perhaps simplifying some of the language within the net zero standard. We got some feedback that it was quite difficult to digest. So we've taken that on board and tried to make it easier to understand. So through this public consultation, we're looking to get your feedback on that as well. But of course, you can see some of the quotes here, and I won't necessarily read them out, but of course it's to continue to align with the science, and of course as a science-based targets initiative, that is our prerogative, but just for you to see that. I will say that we do have a full public consultation feedback report, which is available on our website. So, and this is just a selection of the feedback that we got, but you can look at that feedback in much more detail by checking that report out on our website. Great, okay. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So as mentioned, after the net zero standard went to public consultation, we then have been refining the criteria and also developing guidance. So once we had started to develop that guidance, we wanted to put that to road test with companies. So we had a huge amount of interest in the net zero standard road test, and just due to internal resource restrictions or lack of internal resource, we could only accept 84 companies within the road test. And we tried our best to get a diversity of companies within that. So looking at different industries, geographies, and different emission profiles as well. So within the net zero standard process, we we provided the guidance documents and criteria to companies for them to look at and understand, as well as the net zero tool, which I mentioned will not be part of this public consultation. So companies were able to take that away, and we then conducted various workshops with companies. So we looked at the different practicalities of target setting throughout those workshops to be able to support companies. So at the end of that process, 30 companies have applied for an early validation, and we're hoping that we can get them through that process as well. So with the feedback that we got from the road test, we were then able to refine the documentation that we're providing through this public consultation, and that's what we're asking for feedback on from companies now. Great, okay. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So the next section, we wanted to talk about the pre-launch public consultation and the process for this. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So we have 3 key objectives for this public consultation, and really what we are looking for is essentially a clarity check. So making sure that our stakeholders understand the net zero standards. So first of all, we're looking for feedback on the clarity, the robustness, and the practicality of the criteria and the guidance. The second key objective is to understand support for the science-based targets direction of travel. and also the focus on emissions abatement. So I'll take you through in a minute the framework, and so you'll be able to understand what I mean by that. And then thirdly, of course, we are very keen to engage both directly and indirectly with our external stakeholders to, first of all, I suppose, build support for the net zero standard, but also identify areas of improvement. So the public consultation, of course, opens today and will run until Wednesday, the 6th of October. So it's a relatively short public consultation, just 2.5 weeks. Great. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So here, I just wanted to walk you through the key elements of the net zero standard so that you have an understanding of the framework that we are using for companies to set net zero targets. So the first element of a company's net zero science-based target is the near-term science-based target. So previously, this is just what we call a science-based target. And as mentioned, this was a max 15-year science-based target. That's now been reduced. So the near-term science-based target would be a 5 to 10-year reduction target in line with 1.5C pathways. So as I mentioned earlier, we had strong feedback that net zero targets should be in alignment with 1.5. So the near-term science-based target for net zero must be in alignment with 1.5. The second element of a company's net zero commitment would be a long-term science-based target. So this is a new science-based target. Companies haven't set these, and this is what the net zero tool helps companies to calculate. So really, this target shows companies how much they need to decarbonize to be able to reach net zero and limit global warming to 1.5C. So the max timeframe for this target is 2050, but of course it can be any year before 2050 if the company is able to achieve that level of reduction. And I think it's quite important to say that for most companies, this means reducing emissions by at least 90%. So a company has to be able to reduce their emissions by at least 90% to be able to then claim net zero. At this point, any emissions that are left, they should then be neutralized with removals. So for most companies, they should have a maximum of 10% of emissions, of base year emissions left at this point, then they would be neutralizing with removals. So that's really the third element, so the kind of netting out and using carbon removals. The fourth element of the net zero commitment is that in the transition to net zero, companies are also encouraged to take action or make investments to mitigate emissions outside of their value chains. So there's some examples of that could be purchasing high quality jurisdictional RED+ credits, or perhaps investing in direct air capture and geological storage. So although these investments and actions don't replace emission reductions, the offsetting doesn't replace the emission reductions, but it's still important for companies to be taking these actions and making these investments in that transitional period. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So what we've done is we have developed some guidance documents to be able to assist companies in the target setting process. Now, of course, we haven't, companies will be looking at this to kind of understand what they'll do in the future. But really, the two documents that we have, so the first is the Getting Started Guide. So this is a very short document, essentially a kind of flowchart type document that is a step-by-step guide in setting both near and long-term science-based targets in alignment with the net zero standard. So this document includes further information that will be able to support companies in this process. So it also talks about the planned 1.5C pathways that we have for near-term science-based targets. So at the moment, companies can set 1.5C aligned targets using the absolute contraction methodology, or if they're in the power sector, they can use the sectoral decarbonisation approach. So obviously there's quite a lot of additional pathways that we're working on to allow companies to set 1.5C aligned targets at the sector level. So that gives you some of those details. It also sets out some of the differences between the near-term science-based target requirements and the long-term science-based target requirements as well. And then it also talks about some of the sector-specific requirements for setting long-term science-based targets. So that's all, as mentioned, available on our website for you to look at and understand. The next document that we're requesting feedback on through this public consultation is the Net Zero Corporate Manual and Criteria. So this has now been put into one document. And essentially it's a 6-part manual that gives you really detailed guidance on the net zero standard. So it's a longer document. And it includes information on the terminology and the updates to science-based targets criteria, the mitigation pathways that we use within the net zero standard as well. So some scientific detail around that. It includes the net zero criteria that we're looking at and the recommendations as well. And it also has information on updating and communicating targets, as well as quite a bit of detail for companies in the forest, land and agriculture sector, as the net zero standard applies to those companies in a slightly different way. So you can find out more within that document. Great. Okay. And if we go on to the next slide, please. So as mentioned, there are the criteria is contained within the corporate manual, and it's set out into 4 different sections. The first section is the criteria around near-term science-based targets. It's important to say here that if companies are setting near-term science-based targets, the criteria within the net zero standard do supersede some of the criteria within the regular Science-Based Targets Initiative criteria document. So companies should be looking at both of these documents at this time if they're wanting to set near-term science-based targets. When we do launch the net zero standard in October, the net zero criteria and the regular science-based targets criteria will be combined into one document for ease of use for companies. But at this point, companies would have to look at both of those documents. The second section is around the long-term science-based targets. So this, of course, as I described earlier, this is how the criteria that companies will use to understand if the long-term science-based targets that they're setting hit the timeframe requirements, the ambition requirements, and the boundary requirements of the net zero standard as well. The third section is on beyond value chain mitigation. So this is what I described earlier. It's when companies are looking to take mitigation action outside of reducing their own scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So this could be through investments in offsetting or other different types of beyond value chain mitigation. So that's where we have a criteria and a recommendation as well. And then finally, the last section is around target formulation and reporting. So that really spells out how companies should be describing their target. So company A needs to do X, Y, and Z. That's contained within that section. Great. And now if we go on to the next slide, please. So we have a link at the end of the presentation and actually in the bottom right corner of this slide to the survey. So what we'll be looking for feedback, we'll be looking for feedback through the survey, and we also welcome feedback directly as well. But the survey will be our main source of information for the Net Zero Standard public consultation. And really we're looking at 3 key areas for your feedback. So first of all, we'd like feedback on the overall net zero framework. The second section focuses on overcoming some of the key challenges that you might anticipate that companies would have in adopting the net zero standard, and feasibility issues as well. And then finally, we'll ask questions on the ease of use and the clarity of the net zero standard documentation. So are those supporting materials useful to companies, and are they clear? Great. So I think this actually brings us to the end of my presentation. So let me just check. So I'll hand back to Leah for this section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. And thank you all of you for submitting so many questions that we'll now try to answer. And we do still have quite a bit of time to address some of these questions. So what I will try to do, I will try to group the questions or similar questions that you submitted into buckets to make this as helpful as possible for you. And generally, I think it's good to know that we will make an FAQ specifically on net zero available on the website. And of course, we'll also consider the questions that you're submitting today that we might not get to. But firstly, thanks so much for engaging with us. Great. So maybe a first slightly bigger question for Alberto. I'm sure that both of you would have an opinion on. So several participants mentioned existing net zero definitions or an existing unclarity around carbon neutrality claims, essentially that situation, which was also a bit of the problem statement for this project, that we see huge discrepancies among companies, but also what if you're a company that has put out a net zero strategy and it deviates quite a lot from what the SBTi is now publishing? And essentially we have several people that anticipate that many companies will find themselves in that situation. So of course we cannot foresee the future, but Alberto, maybe you can give a general recommendation to those companies how they should regard the launch of this framework in the context of their already published targets.
Thanks, Leah. I think this is definitely the case and what we observed today. And I think in general, we expect, of course, companies to go through a process of assimilation of the new standard. And I mean, it's a relatively new term, a new concept, and there have been companies that have been pioneers and that have already set net zero targets without necessarily having a standard in place before then. And I would say we would expect companies over time to converge towards the same concept, because ultimately it is the concept of net zero that comes straight from the science, I would say. And the way we see it is the first priority that we see for all companies should be to set the near-term emission reduction targets in line with science. And we hope that all companies, regardless of whether they are planning to, for instance, follow a different pathways to net zero, that they will be reducing emissions in line with science. And the near-term targets is really the most important component right now. That's where we have the urgency to reduce emissions in the short term. And then over time, we believe that there's going to be a convergence around all this terminology in the corporate space. And perhaps for some companies, there will be process of realignment, basically, with the most common terminology.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that as well. There is a section in the corporate manual to guide companies in these situations, because as Alberto said, we did anticipate that this might be a difficult issue for companies. So there is a section that should help in this case as well.
Thanks so much, both. So next one for Emma to start with. General unclarity, or I think it's just general complicated issue, and I think you've explained it in quite a lot of detail in your presentation. But maybe just as another summary on the role of offsetting. So essentially that term that comes up a lot in questions, which we as the SBTi, as part of this project, not necessarily use, but maybe just clarify the terms against the background of the overall term that we still hear a lot in the market, which is offsetting, and that role in the standard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So as with normal science-based targets, offsetting doesn't count towards your emission reductions. So companies still need to be making those absolute emission reductions on the journey to net zero. However, where they do come into play is when you have reached a long-term science-based target, you would then be required to neutralize any remaining emissions. So that's going to be quite a while into the future, and expected to be a kind of maximum of 10% of emissions. However, in the transition, we do encourage companies to make those investments. So although they don't count towards the emission reductions, we do feel that it's very important for companies to make those, take those actions. So that is one of the key recommendations within the net zero standard.
Great, thank you. And there are also several questions generally evolving around the difference between near-term targets and long-term targets. And as you said, Emma, some of the criteria are not the same, specifically around scope 3. So firstly, I would just like to clarify that the version 5 of the criteria for near-term targets is not yet out. But still, Emma, maybe you can just summarize basically how we're seeing the relation between near-term and long-term targets, and specifically around maybe potential differences in the criteria.
Sure. So I guess differences in the criteria between near-term and long-term science-based targets. So for scope 1 and 2, for both near-term and long-term science-based targets, as of next year, they will be required to align with 1.5C. So that's a kind of area of similarity. They both have to cover 95% of the scope 1 and 2 emissions boundary. So those two, that's where it's quite similar. Where it's different, I suppose, is the scope 3. So when we're looking at a scope 3 boundary of a near-term science-based target, you only have to include 67% minimum of your scope 3 emissions. Of course, there are some sector-specific requirements as well. In the long term, companies are required to include 95% of their scope 3 emissions, and Alberto kind of explains the thinking behind that earlier. For the ambition of scope 3 targets, in the near term, there's more flexibility around what companies can use. So the minimum ambition for scope 3 reductions in the near term is well below 2 degrees, whereas in the long term, it's 1.5 C degrees. And in the near term, there's a few different methods that companies can use to set those targets. So they can use supplier engagement targets, they can use absolute contraction targets, they can use physical intensity or economic intensity. So there's a wide variety of approaches that companies take for scope 3 near-term science-based targets. However, in the long term, those pathways are more limited. So for most companies, we're looking at, again, a 90% reduction in scope 3 emissions as well. However, there are sector-specific pathways that look at intensity approaches as well in high-emitting sectors. So, for example, cement or aviation or some of the other transport pathways as well.
Great, thanks so much, Emma. There's another related question to that, actually, which you, I think, basically already answered, which is as long as the 1.5 degree aligned SDAs are not yet available, can we still use the well below 2 degree SDAs? And the answer to that is why we, of course, already encourage you now to set 1.5 aligned targets. And as Alberto said, is the most common target classification. You can still submit well below 2 degree aligned near-term targets, as Emma said, until next year, to be precise, until July 15th, 2022. So maybe a last question for Alberto around progress. This is another question cluster, I would say. How can we make sure, how can stakeholders monitor, and do we monitor whether companies are achieving their net zero science-based targets?
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Yeah, this is a critical point for us and for the credibility of science-based targets. And we started a process to assess progress against science-based targets. In our progress report that was released at the beginning of this year, and we're doing the same exercise for our progress report that is going to be released in January next year. And so this is basically an assessment that the SBTi conducts on companies, and then we disclose the outcomes of this assessment through our progress report. But we're actually planning to start a more formal process, very similar to the net zero process that we have today, to actually develop what we call an MRV protocol for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements for companies that are setting science-based targets or net zero targets. And the idea is that that protocol is going to be the standard that we're going to be using to inform expectations for companies, and then to bring transparency in terms of progress and delivery of science-based targets and net zero targets. And it's going to follow a multi-stakeholder development process similar to this one. And I believe we are going to be launching this process along with our progress report at the beginning of 2022.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, maybe the last question to Emma. Quite a few questions around resource availability, especially around that tool. Maybe you could shortly summarize what can be expected from the resources that will be launched in October, and how much is still to come with the tool that you mentioned will be launched in January.
Yeah, so the documentation, I think we'll put some links in the chat if we haven't already to the documentation on our website, but it's all on the net zero page under resources. So at the moment, we've got the Getting Started guide and the corporate manual, which contains the criteria. When we launch in November, the corporate manual will no longer contain the criteria, because that will be put into the SBTi version 5 criteria. So it's all in one place, as I mentioned. So the only thing that is in addition to that is the net zero tool, as you mentioned. So that will be launched in January when we begin to start validating net zero targets as well. So that's the only thing that we're kind of not releasing it at this point.
All right, thank you so much both, and thank you everyone for submitting so many interesting questions. So with that, let's wrap up the today's webinar. If you could go to the next slide, please. So before we close, we would like to take this opportunity today to encourage you to join the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign that we already heard about from both Alberto and Emma, which is our leadership commitment route to join the Science Based Targets Initiative, but also to join the race to zero ahead of COP26, which will happen in 6 weeks from now. So yeah, we're of course in a decisive time to make COP26 a success, and we really want to work with these leading companies, now almost 800, that are committed to align their business with a 1.5-degree future and to do what is necessary in order to achieve net zero value chain emissions by 2050 at the latest. So we really want to work with this group to have an aggregated voice, also to call for more ambitious policy action and make the upcoming COP the success that it needs to be for the decades to come. Also, because I saw a few questions going in these directions as well. So generally around the implications of the launch of the net zero framework, as well as the new strategy and the upcoming criteria version 5 for companies that already have approved targets, as well as for companies that have already joined the Business Ambition for 1.5-degree campaign. I would just like to direct you to a webinar that we held a few weeks ago that you'll find on the Science Based Targets Initiative's YouTube channel, which basically explains all implications for each company in different states of their SBT journey, so to say. But to those companies that have actually joined the Business Ambition and committed to set long-term net zero targets, as Emma said, we will start validating those targets in January, and those companies will have 2 years to set net zero targets following the upcoming framework. Next slide, please. So before we close, we would just like to thank you again for participating today and for listening, of course, and yeah, very much like to invite you to, of course, now participate in the public consultation. It's open as of today and will be open for around 2.5 weeks until October 6th. You find all the resources on our Net Zero webpage. I think you'll find the link here, and you find the link in the chat as well. And you will find all the resources that Emma mentioned. And we will also make an expanded version of today's slide deck available, basically going into even more detail around the different consultation elements. And you'll, of course, also find the link to the survey online. So your feedback will be much appreciated, and all of you are very welcome to participate. And if you do have any questions following this webinar, or also in relation to this consultation, please get in touch with Paulina and Emma, who are coordinating the net zero development on behalf of the SBTi. So with that, I would like to close the webinar and wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, everyone.